Hello, and welcome to our Dear Lady Elect question and answer session for the Dear Lady Elect book study that Judy Seligman wrote. Thank you for joining us on Facebook or YouTube, wherever you're finding us right now. But we'll be back again at 8 o'clock next week. Tonight we're going to be discussing the April 9th letter. Those are the questions we'll be having today. And with that, Judy is going to give us a summary.
This letter is on the Doctrine of Trials, which we all have our share of. And I don't want to make light of it, because when you're going through something, it is so painful. Your heart's breaking, your dreams are being shattered. You had all these hopes and expectations. And a trial is when you have no visible way out.
Right.
But do you know how a coal is turned into, a hunk of carbon is turned into a diamond? Through pressure and time. So if you're going through something, the first thing we want to do is run. Find our own way of escape. But if we trust God, and we have been talking about the sovereignty of God for several weeks now, if we trust God, we got to believe that there's a purpose in this trial. 1 Corinthians tells us that God does not test us or try us beyond what we're able. And you may think, well, I can't take this anymore. This is beyond my natural strength. That's 1 Corinthians 10:13. And it is beyond your natural strength. Because He doesn't want us to live in our natural strength. He wants to learn to live by the power of God. So what He's doing during the trial, the first thing that He's doing is draining us.
Literally.
Making us a puddle. So there's nothing in us we can depend on. In the heart of the trial, the greater He's going to use you.
That's right.
And another thing He does in Philippians 2:12, it says, He works in us, we know is God. And it says God is in us to work out His good pleasure. And I want to tell you, the Spirit of God is in you, but it doesn't come out of a vessel that's got a tight lid and no cracks, and the seams are all tight. God can't use that vessel. What He uses is broken vessels that have cracks where His Spirit can flow out of. So trials are so important. Every great saint went through a great trial. If you look at King David, he was called to be king when he was 17, but he didn't become king till he was 30. And during that long period of time, God was training him for the position He wanted him to be in. And if God's going to use you, you're going to go through a trial. There's no way out of it. I mean, unless you don't want Him to use you and you want your life to be wasted. So anyway, trials are ordained for our development. They conform us to the image of Christ. And I can remember early on in my life, and I saw that phrase, be conformed to the image of Christ. I knew how far I was away from that. There were maybe some little dribbles of Christ-likeness in my life, but I wasn't conformed to Him.
Right.
I wasn't conformed to His will and His ways and His word. I had a long way to go. And the trials that God brought me through purified me and they sanctified me. The word sanctified means to be set apart. And I really think it sets us apart for God's purpose.
Yeah.
And it also sets us apart from the sin nature we have in us. Not that our old man was crucified with Christ, but we don't know that.
Right.
And it teaches us these things when we learn how to walk in the Spirit and be of use of God, to God. So trials, even though we don't like them, 1 Thessalonians 5:18, regardless, in everything give thanks. the things you don't like and the things you do like. So trials are good for us because they are our gateway into the kingdom of God.
I like in the letter where you refer to it as holy ground. The place of our trials is holy ground.
Yes, yeah, you've been walking on a lot of holy ground lately. So let's look at the questions here. Okay. Okay, this here question is important because, well, let me read the question and maybe you'll know the answer. Jesus was a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. That's from Isaiah 53. Yet he did this without sin. How is his victory transferred to us? Now I want to just make a little comment here. He's a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. His life was filled with trials. And he did it without sinning. Now, when I ended most of my trials in my life, I entered as a sinner and I sinned in the middle of them. Until, I found Christ. So, let me read the question again. Jesus was a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. Yet he did this without sin. How is his victory transferred to us?
Well, because knowing that he has the victory, we can claim that victory. He's in us.
That's the key.
And I know you've taught me this one specifically. Learning that he's inside you was, I think, maybe the first step. But you would then take me a step further and go and find different pieces that applied and said, look, Jesus went through that too. And find other things that would also match. And that clarity would, it's transferred because he's inside you. So then you get the clarity of your trials and say, yep, I can do that too.
Yes.
And then how we get through our own trials will help or encourage someone else another time who may be going through the same trial or something similar, and we can tell them how God walked with us through it because he's in us.
That's it. And the trial brings us into union with him.
Yes.
I mean, he knows how you feel. He was a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. He knows what it is to be hurt, to be disappointed, but he did it without sinning. And he can give us, we can actually go through a trial without complaining, without being cranky, without being miserable, without taking it out on someone else, without blaming anyone else.
Without worrying.
Without worrying or being anxious.
Right.
Because he went through trials and he didn't do any of those things. Those are all sins. And we handle trials with sin. That's how we handle things. But we don't have to be that way anymore because he's in us. We can be one with him and we'll have his perspective on the trial.
Right. Right.
Okay, the second question is, does God have a plan in all suffering?
He does.
Yes. I have to keep telling myself he does. But he does. It doesn't always feel like it. We're so prone to kind of go that way of sin because it feels justified before you learn that there's another way.
That's it. I mean, yeah, and some of us suffer. I mean, like we were saying in the beginning of the message, I mean, some things we go through we cry ourselves to sleep.
They're devastating. They can be truly devastating.
And there's nothing wrong with crying yourself to sleep.
No.
I think there's
as long as you're crying out to God.
Right. That's right. Yeah, we talk a lot about venting.
Yeah.
And it's okay to vent to God.
To God.
Yeah.
We can cry to God.
It's called the venting prayer. No, I'm just kidding.
But we shouldn't be crying in self-pity because
No.
a trial is evidence of God's love for us because he disciplines the child he loves. And it does say that in Hebrews 12:24 that all chastisement is painful for a season, but it produces in us the joyful fruit of righteousness. So you're going through something and you're crying and you're saying, but right around the corner there's the joyful fruit of righteousness that I'm going to experience.
Yeah.
And it's true.
God's going to work this out for my good and for his glory.
Okay, and our last question, which this subject is so important because it comes up in every chapter with every evidence of our faith. It says, how does God's sovereignty affect your decisions?
I think it is so important that it is coming up every time, because you need that trust, and it needs to be in your heart that you really do. Saying it and not really believing it, I don't think you would do half the things we're talking about if you couldn't get that first foundation baked into your heart.
Well, knowing that God's in charge, that God is in control over everything, He's sovereign, I don't need to be afraid. And I think knowing that I don't have to be fearful is a big part of it, because once that fear has been removed, everything else can fall into place.
Remind me of the quiet confidence we speak of.
That's
Yes.
right. And
Yeah.
perfect love does cast out fear.
Yeah.
I mean, most Christians can quote Romans 8:28,
Right.
but do you believe it?
Exactly.
Do you believe that God's working all things, even this?
Oh, I remember, it's a cute story you would say about cooking, and I think you dropped like a jar of sauce,
Yes,
and wondering, how's God going to work this to the good?
that's it. That's it. Even all things,
Yeah.
you know. So, if you don't believe that God's all powerful, sovereign, as you said before, just.
And just that there is a reason behind it. They say everything happens for a reason. But taking it back to His reason, and that it is rightful on how everything kind of, the cards fall. It's His justice with everyone, and who are we to say, no,
Question
you're
it.
wrong, or question it.
Right.
I don't know, I like that word, just.
I know, I like justice too, because it means everything's okay.
It does.
There's a plan, there's a purpose, God's in control. He's just, He wouldn't do something to you that wasn't good and just and fair.
So that it also reminds me of no favoritism. He
Right.
is, we're all His children.
Yeah.
And no matter how much you think this shouldn't have happened to me, or the blame and the self-pity that we have to be careful of, you just don't, it's easier to remove that and not even feel necessary.
I know both of you, not as well as know myself, but I know both of you, and I know you've both been through some trials. And I've seen God work in your lives, and I know He's worked in my life, and I wouldn't trade my trials and those periods of time for anything. At the time, I would have ran if I could have, but God put me in a place where I had nowhere to go but up to Him. But the trials are really the most precious, even though they don't feel like it at the moment. They're precious. They are transforming you
Into the image of Christ.
into the image of Christ. We still have a long way to go, so there'll be more trials, but we can trust Him.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And with that, we thank you again for joining us tonight. And remember, Facebook, YouTube, Dear Lady Elect, just plug it in, and we'll be back with a new one Thursday night. Thanks so much, Judy and Angela. I love you guys.
Love you too, Debbie.
Have a blessed week.